Hello again, book lovers, and today it's the turn of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, which is, of course, an essential book. I should have read it before, but what a good time to read it. I should say it's three books, really. The first book is a tale of a country hick arriving in a big town, making his way, getting a bit gangster, and becoming quite a heavy criminal. There was, of course, the selling of spliffs, reefers, I should say, and the casual passing around of drugs, none of which I particularly have any moral judgment on. But he was a bit of a bad lad when it came to housebreaking. There's also prostitution involved. There are some very heavy characters. West Indian Archie seems to have been the big guy. Nearly killed him one day in a mistake over whether or not $300 was owed over what they would call running the numbers. They would take lottery bets from people. As you can see, it's a hustle. It's the Harlem hustle. Here he is, Detroit Red as he's known then. His slightly reddish hair, which he has conked. This is straightened so that it looks more like a white person's hair. Of course, later he would recognise this as one of the oppressive systems into which he'd fallen. So let's leap forward to that. There is an oppressive system into which he falls, and that's when he goes to prison. He's sentenced there, but he reads a lot, he educates himself, and then he receives a letter from his brother in which he cryptically says, I've got a way you get out of prison. You've got to start by not smoking and not eating pork. So without really knowing why, he begins to follow these instructions, finds out that people start treating him a bit differently. He becomes known as the guy that doesn't eat pork. And then he's kind of drip-fed Islam. Now what's happened is that the other family members have fallen under the influence of Elijah Muhammad, the Black Islam leader. And so at this point you get the usual phenomenon in these cases of suddenly subscribing to a religion, the taking on of a whole backstory of ideas and explanations, one of which I hadn't heard before. This is Jacob's story. See what you think of this. This story is credited to Wallace Fard Muhammad, who was Elijah Muhammad's inspirational leader. So there's a guy called Jacob, and he's born. He's a scientist. This is about 6,500 years ago. And he lived on the island of Patmos, where he hatched a plan to breed white people from the original population of the earth. Jacob is, in theory, the same Jacob as we find in the Christian Bible. The story goes that this unusual child with a big head, somehow utilising the laws of magnetic attraction and repulsion, was able to breed out the black people. In fact, he discovered that black people had a black seed and a brown seed. If you could selectively breed just the brown people, they get less black. This takes 200 years, apparently. Unfortunately, Jacob died when he was 152, but his work was carried on, and he bred from the brown people the white people. The brutal conditions of their creation determined the evil nature of the new race. By lying to the black mother of the baby, this lie was born into the very nature of the white baby, and murder for the black people was also born in them. That sort of stuff. Anyway, so these new whiteys, they came down to cause trouble in Mecca apparently, so they got exiled. They lived for many centuries as barbarians, naked in caves, eating raw meat. But then Moses finally taught them how to wear clothes. He tried to civilize them, but gave it up as a bad job, and in fact blew 300 of them up with dynamite. That's right, dynamite. But it was all too late, and all the races other than the black race were byproducts of Jacob's bleaching process. So there you go, that's maybe a little reason why not to just take a new religion on board wholeheartedly. But there we find Malcolm, ready to take this on. And this is where the book, unfortunately, becomes boring. There's a lot of preaching going on, there's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of insistence. The first part was an excellent portrayal of the Jazz Age. One of his first jobs was the bootblack, and he got to know some of the members of his favourite bands. And these descriptions are very good, very evocative. The segregated dancing. He, of course, sees both of them. He sees the white dancers and the black dancers. He begins to be a bit suspicious of the white people that creep into the black dancers. And with the addition of Elijah Muhammad, he switches into this, to my mind, terrible belief system. It's like the scales fall from his eyes, and you can see, of course, given his circumstances and situation, that if you paint the idea of all the bad stuff comes from the white man and the not so bad stuff comes from the black man, you might make a case. However, after the fallout with Elijah Muhammad, which of course is a big shock to him, Malcolm X begins to take a more moderate view, which is much more to my taste, I have to say. There's pre-echoes of the current critical race theories definitely pulsating in the indoctrinated part of the book. I only hope that the world follows the Malcolm X route out of unshakable belief in a cause to maybe being a little bit suspicious of cure-all philosophies, despite the onset of religion and thus a bit of boredom in the middle. It's a good read, becomes more philosophical at the end. It's full of choice little things, like when he goes to do his Hajj and he meets some Islamic brothers and sisters. He notices that they all group together, the Pakistanis here, the Afghans there, the Arabians here. But he seems to see this as a great uniting of peoples. He also realises that people with lighter skin, in fact one of the Arabs he meets, he says, well, you would think he was white, in a telling description says, but I could tell he wasn't really white because of the sort of the vibes he gave off and his attitude. Thankfully, this experience helps him to see that there are good white people. Let me just give you a snippet of his thinking right in the last chapter. This is the only chapter I'm going to quote from, where he's talking about how there are white churches and black churches in America. Tell me if you can, he says, a sadder irony than that St. Augustine, Florida, a city named for the black African saint who saved Catholicism from heresy, was recently the scene of bloody race riots. Well, I'm not interested in what colour St. Augustine was. He probably was dark-skinned. But to hold up St. Augustine as some kind of a hero is very unfortunate from my point of view. Saved Catholicism from heresy. That's a rum description of what he did to non-Catholics, or what he believed about them, non-Christians I should say, and what he suggested they should be treated as, and his philosophy in general. Let's put it this way, St. Augustine is no friend of mine. Yet here he is, held up as on the strength of his being black, presumably, as a much better example of a Christian. The self-reflection late on, and I say late on because the last chapter is 1965, and he's kind of convinced that he's going to meet a violent death. He says it many times. But as he begins to reflect near the end of the book, he says that Islam teaches him that all religious, political, economic, psychological, racial ingredients, blah 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 blah, make the human family and human society complete. Since I learned the truth, he underlines, in Mecca. Let's not forget he was speaking very heavily about the truth earlier, and it was a different truth. My dearest friends have come to include all kinds. Some Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, agnostics, and even atheists, exclamation mark. Which is heartening, He then tells the story of a student who'd travelled some distance to see him. He tells this early in the book. And found him in a cafe, I think. And they said, oh, look, it's the famous Malcolm X. And she, as a concerned liberal, asked him what could she personally do. And he told her, nothing, you're white, go away. Several hundred pages later, he's saying, I wish I could find that woman and give her a different answer, because that wasn't the correct answer. Here we find ourselves 5 pages from the end. I mean nothing against any sincere whites when I say that as members of black organisations, generally whites' very presence subtly renders the black organisation automatically less effective. Even the best white members will slow down the Negro's discovery of what they need to do, and particularly of what they can do, for themselves, working by themselves among their own kind in their own communities. I sure don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But in fact, I'll even go so far as to say that I never really trusted the kind of white people who were always so anxious to hang around Negroes, or to hang around in Negro communities. Now that's a few page turns from the conclusion, and is a nice summary of where he ended up. There's still a great suspicion about the motives of white people. There's still a tendency to believe that it would be better if we got on with things separately. Of course, I find a lot of difficulty with this, but Malcolm X is known as one of the great polemicists, a controversial figure, much more pacifist inclined, and, as I say, with more open arms at the end than I think his legacy makes us believe. He's always seen as the counterpart to pacifist Martin Luther King, while here we get the aggressive racial stirrer Malcolm X. There's some grain of truth in that, but of course he was also, as I say, very widely read, very philosophical. In another life he would have been a lawyer, he says. He's got that kind of brain. He loves analysing things. He can string sentences together much better than most modern day politicians in a much more thoughtful way, as you can see on clips on YouTube. But at the end of the day, a kind of mixed up character. He couldn't really get hold of why so many Arabs smoked, for example, having been told that no smoking was part of the absolute core beliefs in Islam. He finds that all the Arabs are smokers. Well, not all of them, obviously. A lot of the Arabs are smokers on the Hajj. Well, he justifies this by saying that if smoking had been a thing when the Quran was written, it would obviously have been prohibited. There's that kind of mental gymnastics going on. Fascinating and revealing. But my favourite bit's the first bit where he just tells us what life was like. That's very well written. Well, by Alex Haley, to whom he dictated it. I should have said at the beginning this is all dictated to the author of Roots, and Malcolm X wasn't even that happy to do that, had to be persuaded, sit down with this possibly trustworthy black guy who maybe was in cahoots with the white guy, which is one of his beliefs of any successful black person of the day. He makes good points about who the usual representatives of the black community are. And let's face it, he was courageous and he liked an argument.